We have to go. Now.
But who are they?
No time. Follow me.
Blizzard outside the diner window was not merely a weather event. It was a wall of white hostility that had been building since the early afternoon, erasing the world one street lamp at a time, swallowing the familiar geometry of the city block by block until nothing remained but the howling certainty of the storm. Inside the establishment, the air was stale with the scent of roasted coffee and the lingering grease of the dinner rush, though the customers had long since fled to the safety of their homes, leaving behind only the evidence of their presence / 2014 half-eaten meals, crumpled napkins, a child's forgotten crayon melting against the heat vent. Elena, a 25-year-old woman whose patience was as worn as the linoleum floor beneath her feet, tightened the strings of her red apron over her crisp white shirt, and surveyed the empty room with the quiet authority of someone who had long since stopped expecting the night to be kind to her. She wiped down the counter with methodical circular motions, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering neon sign that buzzed intermittently against the encroaching darkness, its pink light casting strange shadows across the chrome surfaces and the row of vacant stools. It was a night for ghosts and regrets, not for the living. And yet, the bell above the door jingled with a fragile, freezing sound that cut through the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant moan of the wind, announcing an arrival that felt entirely wrong for the hour. Elena looked up, expecting perhaps a stranded motorist or a local drunk seeking refuge from the cold. But the figure that stumbled through the doorway stopped her breath entirely. It was an elderly woman, small and frail, wrapped in layers of expensive but thoroughly soaked wool that clung to her shivering frame like a heavy shroud. The wind howled as the door struggled to close behind her, finally clicking shut and sealing the silence once more. The woman stood there, disoriented, her silver hair plastered to her forehead, her eyes wide with a confusion that spoke of a mind lost in time as much as in space. Elena did not hesitate. The instinct to nurture was a reflex honed by years of taking care of siblings and navigating a life that offered little quarter, so she rounded the counter, her movements fluid and urgent, ignoring the wet slush tracking onto the floor. "Ma'am," Elena asked softly, keeping her voice low to avoid startling the stranger, "you need to come sit down, you're freezing." The old woman looked at her, blinking as if trying to decipher a foreign language, her lips trembling blue. Elena gently took her arm, feeling the bone-deep chill radiating through the wet coat, and guided her to the booth nearest the heater. The woman didn't resist. She seemed to have expended her last ounce of strength just to cross the threshold. Elena knew her manager would be furious if he knew she was keeping the lights on past closing, but looking at the grandmotherly figure shaking uncontrollably in the booth, the moral weight of the moment crushed any professional anxiety she might have harbored. She moved with a renewed sense of purpose, the weariness of her double shift evaporating under the heat of adrenaline and compassion. She went into the kitchen, where the stainless steel surfaces gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and set a pot of broth on the stove. While the soup heated, she returned to the dining area with a stack of clean, dry towels and a heavy wool blanket she kept in her locker for the nights she missed the last bus and had to sleep in the back office. The old woman was staring out the window at the swirling snow, her hand pressed against the cold glass as though trying to reach something on the other side. "It's dangerous out there," Elena murmured, draping the blanket over the woman's shoulders and beginning to gently dry her hair with a towel. The woman flinched at the first touch but then leaned into the warmth, a heavy sigh escaping her lips. "He will be looking," the old woman whispered, her voice a cracked, brittle sound. "My son. He hates the cold." Elena paused, her heart softening at the mention of family. It was clear this woman was loved, likely lost, and that someone out there was probably tearing the city apart looking for her. "We'll find him in the morning," Elena promised, her tone soothing and steady. "Right now, the phones are down because of the storm and the roads are closed. You're safe here." She returned to the kitchen and ladled the steaming broth into a ceramic bowl, adding soft noodles and vegetables. the aroma of ginger and garlic filling the empty space with a sense of home that the rest of the night had completely failed to offer. When she placed the bowl in front of the woman, the elderly guest stared at it with a sudden clarity, tears welling in her eyes. She ate slowly, her shaking hand steadying with every spoonful, while Elena sat across from her, keeping a silent vigil. They didn't speak much. The language barrier was slight, but the barrier of exhaustion was greater. Yet a profound understanding passed between them, the kind that required no translation. Elena saw her own grandmother in the lines of this stranger's face, a universal recognition of vulnerability that demanded protection without condition and without expectation. As the storm raged on, burying the city in silence, Elena realized she couldn't send her away, nor could she leave her alone. She locked the front door, turned off the main sign, and prepared to wait out the long, frozen night in the booth opposite her guest, armed only with a pot of coffee and her own resolve. She did not think about the morning. She did not think about what morning might bring. She simply sat and watched the snow fall and kept the old woman warm. The morning sun did not rise so much as it exploded against the white landscape, a blinding brilliance that shattered the gray monotony of the storm. The snow had stopped, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of pristine glittering powder that softened every hard edge and muffled every sound. Elena woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping with her head on the table. The first thing she checked was the booth across from her. The old woman was still there, curled up beneath the wool blanket, breathing deeply in the rhythm of peaceful exhaustion. Elena exhaled, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and stood up to stretch. The silence of the diner felt heavy and expectant, as if the building itself were holding its breath. She walked to the window to gauge the road conditions, but what she saw made her blood run cold. The empty street, usually desolate at this hour, was filled with a convoy of sleek black SUVs that looked like scars against the white snow, their bodies gleaming despite the weather, their windows tinted to the point of total opacity. They were idling silently, their exhaust plumes rising in unison like smoke signals of war. Before she could even process the sight, the doors of the vehicles opened in synchronized precision. Men in dark tailored suits stepped out into the freezing air, their breath visible in small controlled clouds, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a paramilitary unit. They didn't look like police. They looked like consequences. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she backed away from the window, her instinct to protect the sleeping woman warring with a rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm her completely. The front door of the diner, which she had locked securely the night before, rattled once before the glass was shattered /U 2014 not by a brick, but by a precise, heavy blow from a baton. The sound was deafening in the quiet space. The old woman stirred, waking with a gasp. Elena rushed to her side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder just as the door was pushed open and the men poured in, filling the diner with an aura of lethal, organized menace. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They simply secured the perimeter, their eyes scanning every corner with practiced efficiency until they landed on the booth. Then the sea of dark suits parted, and a man walked in who made the others look like mere shadows. He was tall, perhaps 31, with a face that was devastatingly handsome but carved from granite, his expression devoid of anything resembling mercy or hesitation. He wore a long cashmere coat over a suit that cost more than the diner itself, and his eyes were dark voids that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. This was Ji-yoon, and the energy in the room shifted around him, bending to his gravity as if the very air understood the hierarchy. Ji-yoon's gaze swept over the diner with the precision of a predator assessing a trap, finally locking onto the two women in the booth. For a moment, the silence was absolute /U 2014, a tension so thick it felt as though the air itself had been evacuated. Elena stood up, placing herself physically between the man and the old woman, her hands trembling but her chin raised in defiance. She expected a weapon, a threat, a shout, anything but the quiet, intense scrutiny he leveled at her, as though she were a document he was reading and finding both surprising and useful. "Move," he said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a request. Elena swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "She's sick," Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror gripping her stomach. "She was freezing. I just gave her soup and a place to sleep." Ji-yoon's eyes narrowed slightly, flickering from Elena's face to the red apron she still wore, then to the old woman behind her. The woman, recognizing who had arrived, let out a soft cry. "Ji-yoon," she whispered, the sound fragile and so deeply relieved that it carried its own kind of devastation. The transformation in the man was instantaneous and jarring. The mask of the ruthless architect cracked just enough to reveal a terrified son. He pushed past Elena not roughly, but with an unstoppable force and knelt beside the booth, taking his mother's hands, inspecting them for frostbite with a thoroughness that bordered on desperate, touching her forehead, speaking to her in rapid, hushed Korean. The tenderness of the gesture was so violently at odds with his terrifying entrance that Elena felt a wave of vertigo, as though the floor had shifted beneath her. He listened as his mother spoke, her hands gesturing toward Elena, pantomiming the blanket, the soup, the kindness offered in the dark. Slowly, Ji-yoon stood up and turned back to Elena. The tenderness was gone, replaced by a complex, calculating expression that was harder to decipher than anger would have been. He looked at the empty bowl on the table, the makeshift bed, the stack of damp towels, and finally at Elena's tired, fearful face. He had expected to find his mother kidnapped or ransomed, or worse, dead in a drift somewhere between the street and nowhere. Instead, he found her warm and fed, guarded by a waitress who looked like she would fight an army to protect her. The dynamic in the room had shifted from an invasion to a judgment, and Elena was the subject of it. Ji-yoon stepped closer to Elena, invading her personal space until she could smell the scent of expensive cologne and cold winter air clinging to him. The other men in the room remained statues still, waiting for a command that hadn't yet been given. "You stayed here all night," Ji-yoon stated. "It was not a question. You could have called the police. You could have turned her out." Elena held his gaze, refusing to be cowed by his intensity. "I couldn't leave her in the storm," she answered simply. "It wasn't right." Ji-yoon studied her /U 2014, her eyes, her posture, the rough skin of her knuckles /U 2014, searching for a lie, a hidden motive, a concealed demand for money. He found none. In his world, altruism was a myth, a weakness, or a deception. To find it here, in a rundown diner in the middle of a blizzard, in the hands of a woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, was an anomaly that disrupted his entire calculus. He was a man who believed that everything had a price and that every debt must be paid in full. His mother was his only weakness, the only tether he had to his own humanity, and this woman had preserved it without being asked and without expecting a reward. A traditional payment, cash, a favor, the erasure of a debt seemed insufficient for the magnitude of what had been saved, and simultaneously, a new and opportunistic thought formed in his mind with the cold efficiency of a business decision. He was under immense pressure from his organization's elders to settle down, to present a facade of stability, to bring a wife into the fold who could be trusted not to betray him. He looked at Elena and saw not just a savior. He saw a solution. She was brave. She was moral. And she was clearly unconnected to his treacherous world. "I do not leave debts unpaid," Ji-yoon said slowly, his voice dropping to a register that felt like a caress and a command all at once. "You saved the most important life in my world. Money is not enough." Elena blinked, confused. "I don't want any money. I just did what anyone would do." Ji-yoon stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming the space between them. "No," he corrected her. "Anyone else would have let her freeze or called the authorities to deposit her in a shelter. You protected her." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You are exactly what I require. I do not need to pay you, Elena. I need to claim you." The air in the diner crackled. "My wife," he declared. "You will be my wife." The declaration hung in the air, heavy and absolute, sucking the oxygen out of the room until Elena felt lightheaded. She stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the cruel smile that would indicate this was some twisted joke played by powerful men on the helpless. But his face remained a mask of stone, his dark eyes fixed on her with a frightening intensity that suggested he had already played out the next 10 years in his head and had found the arrangement satisfactory. Elena took a step back, her spine hitting the counter, the metal edge digging in. "You can't just say things like that," she said, her voice trembling but gaining volume as the absurdity of the situation gathered force. "I'm not a thing you can claim. I saved your mother because she was freezing, not because I wanted a proposal from a mobster." She regretted the last word instantly. The men behind him shifted, hands moving toward their jackets. But Ji-yoon raised a single hand to silence them, his gaze never leaving hers. "You misunderstand the gravity of your position," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "My enemies are not fools. They track my mother. They know she was here. And by the time the sun fully rises, they will know who you are. To them, you are now a leverage point, a weakness." He reached out, his gloved fingers grazing a stray curl near her temple, a gesture that was terrifyingly intimate. "If I leave you here, you will be dead within the week. Or worse, they will use you to reach me. I am not offering you a romance. I am offering you a fortress." Elena's breath hitched. She looked at the old woman, who was watching them with sad, knowing eyes. The grandmother nodded slowly, confirming the nightmare with a gravity that made it undeniable. The realization hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. Her act of kindness had been a pebble thrown into a dark lake, and the ripples were now tsunamis threatening to drown her. "So I have no choice," Elena whispered, the fight draining out of her as the reality of her small, fragile life crumbled against his power. "There is always a choice," Ji-yoon replied, his expression unreadable. "You can stay here and pray the shadows don't find you, or you can come with me, take my name, and become untouchable." It wasn't a proposal of love. It was a transaction of survival. And looking into his void-like eyes, Elena understood that she had already lost before she had even opened the diner door the night before. The journey to the heart of the city was a surreal blur of motion and silence, a transition from the gritty reality of her life into a world that felt like a high-definition hallucination. Elena sat in the back of the lead SUV, sinking into leather seats that were softer than her bed at home, while Ji-yoon sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance that was somehow more unnerving than proximity would have been. His presence filled the cabin like a pressurized gas, displacing everything else. Outside the tinted windows, the city passed by /U 2014, the snow-covered streets where she waited for buses, the corner stores where she bought groceries, the bus shelter with the broken heating panel she'd stood beside 100 times. All of it looked distant and small, as if she were viewing her past life through the wrong end of a telescope, already becoming a story she might tell about someone else. She looked down at her hands, still red and chapped from the dishwater, resting awkwardly against the pristine interior of the car. She felt like an imposter, a rough sketch in a gallery of oil paintings. Ji-yoon seemed to sense her unease because he didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply took out his phone and began issuing commands in Korean, his voice sharp and authoritative, and she caught enough in his tone to understand he was dismantling someone's existence with the casual efficiency of a man signing forms. When he hung up, he turned to her with a calmness that was almost unnerving. "My home is secure," he said, breaking the silence. "You will have your own wing. You will not be touched unless you wish to be, but in public you are mine. That is the price." Elena looked at him, searching for the monster she knew he must be, and found instead the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the heavy burden of a man who held up the sky for everyone around him and had no one to hold it for him in return. "And your mother?" she asked quietly. "She stays with us." "She likes you," he confirmed. "That is rare." The car slowed as they approached a towering glass spire that pierced the skyline like a needle through silk. As the heavy iron gates rolled open, Elena felt a finality settle in her chest, heavy and irreversible. The diner, the red apron, the struggle for rent, the double shifts and the missed buses / U 2014, all of it was gone. She was stepping into a cage. Yes. But as the massive doors of the building opened to reveal a lobby of marble and controlled light, she realized it was a cage built to keep the wolves out, not only to keep her in. Time in the penthouse moved differently than it did in the world below. It was fluid, silent, and measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the changing quality of light on the floor-to-ceiling windows, by the shifting moods of the city spread beneath them like a map of everything she had left behind. Elena had been living in Ji-yoon's fortress for 3 weeks, and the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a strange, tension-filled domesticity that she couldn't quite name and didn't entirely resist. Her wing of the apartment was larger than her entire previous apartment building, filled with closets of designer clothes that fit her perfectly / U 2014, a detail that unsettled her with its efficiency, as though her body had been measured by someone who had never asked permission. Yet she refused to play the part of the idle ornament he perhaps expected. She spent her mornings with his mother, Mrs. Park, who taught her how to play card games and told her stories about Ji-yoon's childhood, chipping away at the myth of the ruthless architect to reveal the lonely, driven boy beneath. One evening, the professional chef had prepared a French meal that was technically perfect but lacked soul, and Elena, craving the heat and spice of comfort, had taken over the kitchen late at night to make a stew rich with gochujang and garlic, the smell of it permeating the sterile modern air and filling the penthouse with something that felt, against all odds, like warmth. She didn't hear Ji-yoon enter. He had returned from a meeting, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a dark bruise blossoming on his neck. He stood in the doorway, watching her hum as she stirred the pot, a look of profound confusion and longing on his face that he hadn't been careful enough to hide. When she turned and saw him, she didn't gasp or retreat. She simply reached for a bowl. "You look like you've been in a fight," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, sliding the steaming bowl across the granite island toward him. "Eat. It helps." Ji-yoon stared at the food, then at her. In his world, women asked for jewelry or ignored the blood. They didn't offer sustenance without calculation. He sat down, the exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders, and took a bite. The heat of the spice hit him, grounding him in the present in a way that nothing else had managed to do that entire brutal evening. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why do you stay? The guards would stop you at the gate, yes, but you haven't even tried." Elena leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Your mother needs me," she said. Then she hesitated, something shifting behind her eyes. "And maybe I'm tired of being afraid of the world. Here, the monsters are at least polite." A ghost of a smile touched Ji-yoon's lips / U 2014, the first genuine expression she had seen since the diner. "Not all of them," he murmured, meeting her eyes. In that shared silence, something fundamental changed between them. The transaction began, almost imperceptibly to BL.